Hi, everyone. My name is Chanda Chevannes, and I'm the producer and director of Living Downstream. Thanks so much for joining us for our first ever virtual screening and Q&A of the film. I'd like to start by doing a land acknowledgement for our event tonight. So although we're not gathered in the same physical space, I'd like to acknowledge the land from which I'm speaking. I'm joining our event today from Toronto, Canada, which is covered by Treaty 13. It's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, with whom this treaty was made, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our event sponsors. Thanks to Ithaca College's Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. Sandra Steingraber, who's the main subject in our documentary and who will be joining us for a Q&A after the film, is a distinguished scholar in residence at Ithaca College. So I'm very grateful to that department for co-presenting this screening tonight. I'd also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts. The Canada Council for the Arts jumped into action quite early in the wake of COVID-19 to try to help support artists who were going through a difficult time. And one of the amazing initiatives that the Canada Council put forward was something called Digital Originals, which was funding artwork to be transformed for the digital space so that we could all enjoy works of art while staying safely at home. And we were lucky enough to receive a grant from the Canada Council for that work. And so that's why we're able to bring this screening to you today, as well as a screening of Unfractured, which is my second collaboration with Sandra Steingraber, which will be happening on Monday, October 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern time as well. So a few housekeeping details just before we start. The film is 85 minutes long. After the screening, we'll let the credits roll in full, and then I'll be joined by Sandra Steingraber and also our guest moderator, Shelby Lisk, and we'll have a Q&A session at that time. Now, if you look at my image and then you look just below it, on the right-hand side, you'll see a little chat window there. You can put your questions for the Q&A into the chat window, and we'll get to as many of the questions as possible. So I'd just like to take a moment to reflect on the fact that Living Downstream was released 10 years ago. And in that past decade, it feels like an awful lot has changed in my life personally, but also more broadly in the world. A decade ago feels like a century ago in some ways, and I know there's lots of jokes about that. But I believe that there is a lot in Living Downstream that is still really relevant to what we're experiencing today. And I'm looking forward to having a really dynamic conversation about that with Sandra and Shelby after the film. So I hope you enjoy the film, and we'll see you when it's done for a Q&A. Thanks so much.
There was once a village along a river. The people who lived here were very kind. These residents, according to parable, began noticing increasing numbers of drowning people caught in the river's swift current. And so they went to work, devising ever more elaborate technologies to resuscitate them. So preoccupied were these heroic villagers with rescue and treatment that they never thought to look upstream to see who was pushing the victims in. This is a walk up that river, the river of human cancer. As a young biologist, when I was diagnosed with bladder cancer, I asked that question that all people who are newly diagnosed with cancer ask, which is, why me? But as a biologist, I ask it in a very biological way. I would go into the hospital to have my checkups and to sit with other cancer patients, and I would try to engage physicians or nurses about environmental causes of cancer. And that was just not part of the conversation. It was just outside the frame of the discussion. And yet I could go back to my scientific data and go into the medical library and look up information about carcinogens and cancer, and there's quite a vast body of knowledge. So I was very puzzled. Why is there this breach between what scientists know and even what the medical community talks about to their patients about causes of cancer? It seemed like somebody needed to build a bridge.
Hey, there she is. Hi, Mom. Hi. You get to see faces?
Yeah, I got
Okay.
Yeah, so did you have a good trip?
It was okay.
Long,
It was
though.
long. It was hard on the kids. How many more towns do we have? At one point there was 14, and Elijah thought, oh, I
Right.
can't take 14 towns. So how's Uncle Jack doing?
Well, I think he's doing pretty fair.
Were you there when he took his first medication?
He put it off for a day or so because he was having some side effects of other medications and whatever, so it was scary for him to take it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, well, when I took my chemotherapy, that I used visual imagery and a lot of thinking and stuff. And I said, I just pretended like my medication was like a Pac-Man, and that it was going to go in there and eat up all the bad guys.
Yeah.
But he's handling it really well.
When you were diagnosed and I was a teenager, he was like he and Aunt Annie were like second set of parents to me.
That's true.
And we really needed their help, and now I was, you and I have both been down this road, and
I'm one of those people who really does come from a family with a lot of cancer in it. I wasn't the first in my family to be diagnosed. My mother was already in treatment for cancer. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 15 and had suffered a metastasis and a spread of her cancer when I was 17. So my mom and I were actually in treatment at the same time for a while. I think a silence fell over our family. That's how I remember it. We've become close subsequent to that, but it was after a lot of good checkups for both of us. Then slowly we found a language to talk with each other.
sometimes I say, well, my mom had metastatic breast cancer by the time she was 46, and now she's a great-grandmother, and what she always told me was, don't let them bury you until you're dead.
People would say, well, how do you think she looks? Do you think she's going to make it? They were they either want you to get well so they don't have to worry about you, or they want you to die so they don't have to worry about you.
Yeah.
That's what I feel.
People don't like that in-between place.
No, they really
and that's
don't.
where people with cancer live.
That's right, that's right.
Right after my diagnosis, the first thing I did, I wanted to go right to college, and you insisted I come back
your
here.
ears.
I pierced my ears. Wow, that was a big rebellion, huh?
My aunt went on to die of the same kind of bladder cancer that I had. I have uncles with prostate cancer, colon cancer. So there's a lot of cancer in my family. But the punchline of my story is that I'm adopted. So I knew that the cancer that ran in my family didn't necessarily run in my genes. And that awareness, I think, that I brought as an adoptee, in addition to my professional training as an environmental biologist, led me to think about what else families have in common besides chromosomes. They have in common drinking water wells often, air supplies. They often work in the same factories, live downwind from the same industries, or next to the same farm fields.
Here's the stadium where I first ran a mile. That was a very exciting day. There's the lagoon where I caught my first fish, and the hospital where I was diagnosed with bladder cancer. I had a nice view of that lagoon. This is Normandale. This is an unincorporated subdivision of Pekin that's flanked by industry. The street names are named for the products that the people who lived here used to make. So there's Fleischmann Street for Fleischmann yeast and Cairo for Cairo syrup. In the 1990s, the people here alleged they had a cancer cluster, and they asked the county public health department for an investigation. Some of the streets they alleged had a cancer patient living in every other one of these homes. And the county promised to do a state-of-the-art investigation. And what they did instead was send out surveys to each of the houses to complete and fill out rather than go door to door. And they concluded from that that there was no cancer problem here. People themselves, some of whom don't even really read, so if you're illiterate, you couldn't fill out the survey, but they also noticed something else, which was that if you had had cancer and died, you couldn't fill out the survey. I was pretty shocked at the primitive nature of the investigation that was done here. It seemed that there wasn't really a serious attempt to get to the bottom of the problem. No real resources were spent, especially compared to other cancer cluster investigations. The one in Long Island, where millions of dollars were spent and Congress people were involved. There's another big ongoing investigation in Cape Cod to investigate high rates of breast and prostate cancer there. But here in Little Normandale, where people are working class, they don't have friends in Congress, they can't command private and state resources, no one came out to help.
The question becomes what the causal relationship between chemical manufacturing, use, and disposal is, and then the number of people who are getting sick and dying. The next question that emerges is, how much evidence do you want before you begin to do something different? Do you want an inkling of harm? Do you want absolute proof? Do you want something in the middle? And who gets to decide? Is it those who are being exposed? Is it those producing the chemicals? And that, I think, is a question of our age.
There's a lot of places in the United States that when you go to them, you ask, where did all this stuff come from? You know, like in New York City, you wake up and you're in the city and there are markets with food from all corners of the earth and clothing and jewelry and diamonds and you just imagine all the far-flung places in the earth that those things came from. Pekin is the other kind of place. Massive amounts of chemicals are produced here. One factory kind of attracts another, and pretty soon you're living near a lot of industry which are using chemicals that are inherently dangerous and don't stay inside the factory walls. There's also corn and beans on the floodplains right near here, and pesticides are used to grow them. There's no barrier to keep those chemicals from migrating into the water, from evaporating into the air currents here. My hometown always brings me to the question, where is all this stuff going?
The weed killer atrazine is one of many chemicals that we're concerned about. Atrazine is one of our most popular pesticides. It is used on more than 3/4 of cornfields in my home state of Illinois. It's very water soluble, and atrazine works by poisoning from within. So it's applied to the ground itself. It dissolves in the water inside the soil. It gets inside the water that runs off of farm fields into surface water. and as a falling curtain of chemicals falls with the rain. When atrazine enters the rain, it's carried hundreds of miles from where it was applied to kill a few weeds.
This is spec 9, right?
So we are on the Salinas River. There is atrazine used here. And where we're at now, almost pretty much all of this water is from agricultural runoff.
Oh, maybe there was two. Isn't that where I caught one? Maybe there was two. Because I missed one, and then one popped up right there where I missed.
So it's probably one of the more contaminated areas. There's good data to show this, with pesticide runoff and also with nitrates, fertilizers. So this is what we consider our unclean site.
Got it. Thought I heard something over here. I heard it come out of the water. That's how I knew it was over here. Let's see if he has any little friends. Hello, my friend.
Spec 07, buffer in 21, 42, 35.
There's almost no aquatic environment, including rainwater, that's atrazine-free. I've always been sort of interested in how the environment can affect growth and development and reproduction. And amphibians are great for that because they are vulnerable to the environment. There's no placenta, no eggshell. There's nothing to protect it from contaminants that might be in the water. So anything that you put in the water has access to that developing embryo.
So this is Darnell. Darnell's going to be famous. He's the first genetic male frog that actually completely turned into a female upon exposure to atrazine. So he's been exposed to atrazine at 1 parts per billion since tadpole stage, and now he's an adult male that mates with other males and that actually lays eggs. So he's a functional female. He may very well be a hermaphrodite if we dissect him, but he's a functional female anyway, and he has now lots of genetic male sons that have also turned into females after exposure to atrazine.
We've always worked in what I call ambient levels of atrazine. So we've always worked with levels that you would find, in your drinking water, for example. Effects have been shown in fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So every vertebrate class that's been examined, atrazine has these endocrine disrupting effects that include impairment of reproduction or lowering reproductive success and performance. And we have good evidence now that atrazine turns on an enzyme, and an enzyme is like machinery that's used to convert something. And in this case, it converts testosterone into estrogen. In the frog, converting testosterone into estrogen causes a male to turn into a female, to grow ovaries and eggs. And we now know in humans, converting testosterone into estrogen is very important in breast cancer, which is often estrogen dependent. So you might be looking at a frog underwater and a human going, gee, what's the connection? But the connections are that we use the same hormones, we have many of the same genes acting in the same ways, and we use the same water. So the water that, when we go down to Salinas, I tell people all the time, we're studying frogs in the agricultural runoff. All those pesticides that have run off the crops are in that water, destroying immune systems, destroying reproduction, lowering sperm count of frogs. But the first species exposed to those same pesticides are humans, and they're exposed at much, much higher levels.
There are individuals who claim, as a form of dismissal, that the links between cancer and environmental contamination are unproven and unprovable. There are others who believe that placing people in harm's way is wrong. Whether the exact mechanism by which harm is inflicted can be precisely deciphered or not. At the very least, they argue, we are obliged to investigate, however imperfect our scientific tools. With the right to know comes the duty to inquire. I was about 10 years out from my own bladder cancer diagnosis. And so I had been slowly gathering string on the question of bladder cancer and its causation. And what I had already learned was that we have absolute proof in some cases of a link between certain kind of textile dyes, for example, and certain kinds of bladder cancer, the kind of bladder cancer that I myself had. And what I also had already learned was that in spite of this vast accumulation of knowledge, there had been little done to phase these chemicals out of commerce. So I guess that was a shocking realization to me. So in 1993, I left my tenure-track job as a biologist, left the lab bench for good, and reinvented myself as somebody who writes about scientific evidence for the public. I see myself now as somebody who spends her days putting jigsaw puzzles together. Each study is like a jigsaw puzzle piece. Even though all by themselves, you usually don't have absolute proof in the case of any one study. When you begin to assemble the pieces, a picture sometimes emerges. And it's as though all these little arrows of evidence are all pointing in the same direction. It's difficult to overestimate the impact that World War II had on chemicals. For example, the pesticide DDT was first used to halt a typhus epidemic in Italy and then helped to win the war. Once the war was over and we had big stockpiles of all these chemicals, we felt that we needed to find marketplaces for these chemicals. They needed to be seen as safe, even though no advanced testing had ever been done. They were developed under the secrecy of wartime. They were very rapidly deployed. We didn't have time to do any testing. And now, to keep our economy going, we still weren't going to test. We just wanted to sell them.
We've heard the benefits of pesticides. We've heard a great deal about their safety, but very little about the hazards. And yet the public was being asked to accept these chemicals and did not have the whole picture. So I set about to remedy the balance there.
There were people who were expressing the need to slow down and take a look at what's going on. And that's exactly the conversation that Rachel Carson resurrected when she wrote Silent Spring.
This is one of the nation's bestsellers, first printed on September 27, 1962. Silent Spring has been called the most controversial book of the year. Biologist Rachel Carson worked 4 years in the preparation of Silent Spring. What she wrote started a national quarrel.
We should have legislation requiring that these pesticide chemicals be thoroughly tested for a genetic effect.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts.
Children born today are exposed to these chemicals from birth, perhaps even before birth. Now, what is going to happen to them in adult life?
By the time I was born in 1959, DDT had reached its peak usage in agriculture and was already in breast milk and was already in baby food. And so that the baby boom generation came to be the first generation of children to be born with toxic chemicals in our umbilical cord blood, in our brains, in our fat. And we also have higher rates of cancer than our parents did when they were our age. I feel that Rachel Carson planted the vineyard, if you will, that I'm now laboring in, and her insistence that we begin to look closely at the links between environment and health and not turn our faces away from that is a call that I have taken up. What I sit around and think about all day are things about, 2-year-olds with cancer, or why are bone cancers rising among the elderly. Scary topics. And my intent is not to scare people or alarm people. My intent is to enact this idea that knowledge is power, and that people have a right to know what's going on with their environment and what might be affecting their health.
Ecologist, biologist, author, and cancer survivor, Dr. Sandra Steingraber is an internationally recognized expert on the environmental links to cancer and reproductive health. Sandra's been described as the Rachel Carson of this generation. We call her the poet laureate of the environmental health movement. Sandra Steingraber, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeannie. What an honor to be here. The role that the environment plays in human health is the focus of my ongoing research and writing. A lot of my readers actually find it very depressing, and they feel that they are almost afraid to hear about the environmental links to cancer because they are afraid of this despair that it will make them feel. If we can't talk about these things, how can we begin to take action? I'm reminded of the AIDS activists of the 80s who marched under that banner, silence equals death. It's time to break the silence around what's going on, and we need to have a conversation, a really honest one, about what's happening. Thus, finding ways to prevent cancer and not just racing for its cure is an imperative need. And here's where I hope my report has something to offer. There's a part of me that can really disconnect my emotional life from the data. I can look at a whole bunch of data on, let's say, the rising rate of ovarian cancer among teenage girls and suspend whatever thoughts I might have about the girls whose lives are represented by those data points. And at the same time, there were moments where I was done with the analysis and I would look at the data points again, and I would be reminded that each little black dot on a white graph was the life of a girl. Who was that girl? This isn't just an intellectual question. This is about people's lives being wrecked or being saved. There's a monument in Washington, D.C., which commemorates the dead from World War II. Because the number of Americans dead of World War II exceeds 400,000, one star represents 100 fallen soldiers. As you look at these stars and realize each one equals 100, the monumentality of the amount of death it's overwhelming. Every year, more than 600,000 North Americans in the United States and Canada die of cancer. You could construct a monumental wall of stars with each star representing 100 dead from cancer every year. I travel a lot in the work that I do, and it can feel disorienting. So I've acquired a habit wherever I go to run in the city in which I've been invited to. There's something about running that helps me understand the land, to learn it by the feeling of my footfall is one way of knowing where I am. But I also do something else before I visit a city, and that is I check the toxics release inventory for the city in which I'm visiting and take a look at the list of toxic chemical emissions into air and into water, look at where the dump sites are. And that's another way of knowing the place where I'll be. In northern New Hampshire, the White Mountain Range lies across the northern part of that state like a crooked crown. At the top of those mountains, where there are no signs of human activity, there's no agriculture, there's no industry, an unusual discovery was made there. The leaf litter under the trees contains a surprisingly high amount of PCBs. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, are an industrial chemical that are classified as a persistent organic pollutant, meaning that they last a long time in the environment. They're not broken down easily. The only explanation is that these chemicals have been carried like unwanted migrants by prevailing winds and deposited there. At some point, the ambient temperature reaches the evaporation point of PCBs, and they rise up into the air and they travel around in the atmosphere. As they travel north, their condensation point is reached and they come back down to Earth, usually with precipitation. Summertime comes again and the temperatures go up, and then they once again rise. And if they're carried further north, at some point their condensation point is reached again, and then they come back down to Earth. Through this kind of grasshopper leaping, they move further and further north until finally it's cold enough that they're not going to evaporate again. And at that point, they insinuate themselves into the food chain of that colder area.
We know that beluga whales are exposed to PCBs. They're the top predator of their environment, so they will feed on carnivore fish that feed on herbivore fish that will feed on plankton, etc. So every time you may increase a trophic level, you're going to have a bioaccumulation of PCBs.
Non, mais attendez, il faut pas qu'il sorte. Puis s'il y a quelqu'un qui peut rester juste à côté pour éviter qu'il tombe.
Here we have a population of beluga whale where we find cancer on a regular basis.
Okay, c'est bon.
So that kind of suggests that this population is exposed to some kind of risk factor, if you want, or some kind of substances or agents that promote the development of cancer in these animals.
So we have the adrenal glands. This is an organ that we are interested in because a lot of the contaminants that the beluga whales are exposed to, there's actually some metabolites of those contaminants that would target the tissue of the adrenal gland. What you can easily see if you compare the two glands is that the right one is larger than the left one, and it's mainly because there's a big cyst on it here.
We know that beluga whales are exposed to a lot of different contaminants. But when we think about cancer, probably the ones that we have to point out first will be the PEH. PEH are produced by incomplete combustion. Because of the proximity of the aluminum smelter, we have been identifying that as a potential source because they're so close to the beluga whale habitat. PCBs share the same enzymatic pathway as the PAH. So there's a possibility that the PCBs and the pH are acting synergistically to cause cancer. So you look at these animals that seem to be affected by industrial contamination, and you have to ask yourself, well, could that also happen to us?
Like a jury's verdict or an adoption decree, a cancer diagnosis is an authoritative pronouncement, one with the power to change your identity. It sends you into an unfamiliar country where all the rules of human conduct are alien. In this new territory, you disrobe in front of strangers who are allowed to touch you. You submit to bodily invasions. You agree to the removal of body parts. You agree to be poisoned. You have become a cancer patient. Do you want raisins in your oats, Elijah? Raisins? Hey, sweetie. I was just asking Elijah, do you want raisins in your oats? Yeah.
Had a good night's sleep last night.
Elijah, I'm going to have you in art on Friday.
Last year, art was on Wednesday.
Hey, let me get your hair combed. How do you want it up? Do you want it up today?
Yeah.
When you have cancer young, your ability to kind of lay a plan is taken away. There are things in this world in which you need to presume longevity. When you get married, when you have a child, these are kind of lifelong projects.
Is this counts? Yeah, it counts.
Do you guys want to pick more peaches this weekend? I think this is the very last of the peaches now. There's this presumption in my mind that I need to take care of things even before they should be taken care of, because I feel like I need to get this message into them now, because who knows what will happen to me. I don't know what caused my cancer. I'm only a population of one. I would not be able to say with certainty that the cause of my disease was any one chemical. We can't say that biologically. But what we can say is that when you have carcinogens in a drinking water supply, or in an air supply, or in a food web, somebody's going to get cancer. The day of my annual cystoscope, which is the procedure by which I was first diagnosed, I always seem to go through a whole arc of feelings. Start with this kind of fretfulness and irritation.
Elijah, you need your raincoat.
Faith, are you coming? Here's your backpack. Okay, the bus will be here any second, so why don't you run around a bit? I don't think it's raining yet. Okay, go get your leg. It's as if I resent every year having to kind of go back to the scene of the crime. And here I am 29 years later, still being forced to confront this thing, and I hate it. Well, you know, I have my cysto this afternoon, right? Do you remember when I packed my socks for my surgery? And,
Yeah.
So
you have warm feet.
Yeah, I always feel like I'm not naked as long as I have my socks on.
Yeah.
They let me wear the socks right in the operating room.
Right.
Yeah. I got special permission. I was reading something in the newspaper about, I don't know, some
women's field hockey or something where everybody's talking about their lucky underwear and their little special things. If you're an athlete and you have your lucky ritual, it actually makes a difference, right? Because it changes your psychology and you go in and the outcome is different, maybe, because you have your little pregame thing that you do or your special thing that you wear. But I understand that my socks don't change. Either they're going to find something or they're not, and it doesn't matter what socks I wear. It doesn't.
Really?
No, I mean,
Yeah.
you know. So it's less rational than an athlete wearing their lucky jockstrap, right? I mean, that could actually change what happens on the court. It doesn't matter what I wear. It's not going to change, but it makes me feel protected. For some cancers, like the kind that I had, like bladder cancer, like breast cancer, if a 5-year I'm free of symptoms is only a statistical reality. It doesn't mean anything biological. There are cancers like bladder and breast cancer that can come back 10, 20, 30 years later. And so to say you're a cancer survivor is a little bit like whistling in the dark.
Go ahead and lay there. Okay. For this first one.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Any changes, major changes health-wise that I need to know about since I saw you last?
No, I don't think so.
No urinary infections in the last year?
No.
Okay, just let your knees forward a little bit more. A little bit of pressure now. Can you see this, Sandra?
I'm not a looker. I'm just going to look at the ceiling tiles.
This is the area of scarring where you originally had your tumor in 1979. Looks fine. Excellent. I'm all done.
Okay.
So I collected a specimen which we'll send for cytology, and just like in the past, if you don't hear from me, then you can assume
Right.
that came back okay.
Okay.
You can go ahead and sit up, just careful because you're on the edge there.
go today?
It was okay. I even made an appointment for a year from now, right?
Really?
So, yeah. Well, a year seems like a long time. He did the usual thing of collecting the cells for cytology, but I'm not expecting to hear anything bad about that.
I'm so glad about that.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking about it tonight. With any luck, it won't rain. We'll put the kids to bed.
Yeah.
Jeff and I can come out, sit in the backyard, listen to the crickets.
Yeah.
You know, it's my normal life. I'm like this normal person sitting in my backyard.
Yeah. So glad.
A normal person sitting in my backyard. Oh, God. And you know, even the little card they give you, you know, that says your next appointment is, you know, a year from now. It just felt like, woohoo. I don't know why, but it seemed like a long way, so. Children are more vulnerable than adults. They breathe more air, they drink more water, they eat more food on a pound-for-pound basis than we grown-ups do, which means the environmental world is moving through them more rapidly and more profoundly than for us. What allows them to grow are the rearranged molecules from the environment in the food, air, and water that are flowing into them and rearranging themselves to form this new human being. When a female rodent is exposed to atrazine early in life, it can actually alter the development of the breast tissue itself. The effect of that is that it keeps the breast in an immature state for a longer period of time. And an immature breast is a vulnerable breast.
We know at least 60 or 70% of the public is exposed to atrazine on a daily basis, either from levels in the drinking water or from the food that they eat. This shows basically pictures of what happens during the development of the mammary gland in a rat. And these are similar things that happen in a person. This was a study that we did about 5 years ago, and we were the first to report that in utero exposure to atrazine resulted in major effects on the structure of the breast. So if you even compare, you can already see that there's a lot less structure in here with exposure to atrazine. And as the animal grows, going through puberty and even to adulthood, it never fully develops and never really looks like the full gland. This early life exposure, not only does it alter the structure of the breast, but it makes it difficult for this animal when it grows up to nurse its offspring. There have been studies that have indicated that if you then expose these animals to a second chemical, you get a higher cancer rate. We all start from a single fertilized egg, which then divides and divides again and eventually becomes a whole baby. And then that newborn baby grows so that it then becomes a toddler. So when you have tissues and organs that are rapidly growing and rapidly developing, they're more susceptible to interference by different kinds of chemicals. In addition, during this growth period, many of our systems in our body which protect us against chemicals are not fully developed. We have a great deal of variability, not only in exposure in our human population, but in susceptibility because of gender, because of age, because of past history, and of course because of genetics. I often say that if a chemical causes several kinds of effects in a couple of different species, maybe at several different points in life, I think we are naive to think that all people would be resistant to the effects of that chemical.
As a woman with cancer who grew up in a county with hazardous waste sites, several carcinogen-emitting industries, and public drinking water wells that, from time to time, show detectable levels of toxic chemicals, I am less concerned about whether the cancer in my community is more directly related to the dump sites, the air emissions, the occupational exposures, or the drinking water. I am more concerned that uncertainty is too often parlayed into an excuse to do nothing.
Heavenly Father, we pause for just a moment to give Thee thanks, to praise Your name. We thank You for this beautiful day, for life, Father, for health, for strength, for the good food that is before us. We give Thee thanks again, praising Thee in Jesus' name. Amen.
So you said you had to give a speech?
Mm-hmm.
When are you going to do that?
Wednesday.
So are you like used to giving speeches and lectures and you're comfortable with that?
Yeah, it's one of the few things I do really well, I think.
I'm the exact opposite. I get so nervous.
There's a nice breeze, isn't there, blowing?
Oh, it's the best time to be on the porch.
Yes, I see though a lot of the windmills kind of shut down.
So they shut down and then they turn?
They can turn a 360, but then they have to unwind to get back to where they want to go. But like the propeller, the pitch changes continually all the time. They're seeking for the best wind, and very, very interesting to watch.
My cousin John still farms in Illinois. He has an ability to crumble a piece of earth and feel its texture, feel its friability, its ability to grow a cornstalk based on how it feels in the palm of his hand.
Well, we never run out of weeds, do we? There's always
weeds.
One more to pull, yeah.
And they seem to grow faster than anything else in the garden.
Yeah, but that's a good sign. If you can grow good weeds, you should be able to grow good crops too. So,
you think?
Well, it means you're getting the right moisture and right sunshine.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, without those, nothing will grow.
That's true. Well, I guess after this last rain, you're gonna be out here weeding again pretty quick.
Yeah, I think you're right. Every time we get a rain, we enjoy it, but it starts a new flush of weeds. We will use a little bit of atrazine usually in the spring, and it'd be nice not to have to use any. It's expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in production ag today, it's pretty difficult not to. We try very hard to pick our places we use it. We want to keep it out of the water sources. You know, we stay, hundreds of feet from any open creeks or surface drains, wells, things like that.
I have incredible admiration and respect for John. He's the cousin I feel the closest to of my 20 cousins. And yet, the truth is that he uses chemicals that I believe should be abolished. I think it's beyond the ability of the most careful and caring farmer like my cousin John to keep this chemical inside the weed the farmer is trying to kill. And I'm sure he's very careful. I'm sure he's not the only farmer who's very careful. Most farmers have an intense respect for what they do. And yet we still see farm chemicals in the drinking water. And we still see that farmers' children have higher rates of cancer than non-farmers' children. Nobody can be careful enough with a chemical like atrazine.
Thanks for coming,
I think it's hard to go back into your home community and talk as an expert on anything and as an authority on anything to people who remember you from Sunday school and remember that you got thrown out of choir when you were 5 for singing too loudly and things like that. And there's a humility I feel about going back home, and especially talking to farmers. Farmers are not my enemy. Farmers know the land and know the issues in a deeper way than I ever will. And yet, I feel I have some knowledge that they really might want to hear about.
This is breast milk. It is 4% butterfat, just the way cow's milk is. Inside that milk, there are antibodies that are swarming around. So any disease that the mother has ever been exposed to, including diseases that she's been vaccinated against, she'll make antibodies in her Peyer's patches. They travel up to her breast and find their way into the breast milk so that the nursing infant is protected from all those diseases until it can get its own immune system up and running. In this jar of milk are all kinds of growth factors whose job it is to stimulate the development of the brain and to stimulate the development of the digestive tract and to stimulate the development of the immune system. Breastfed infants grow into children who have lower risk for autoimmune problems such as diabetes, Crohn's disease, juvenile arthritis, leukemia, allergies, and eczema. So now I want to talk a little bit about breast milk from a chemical point of view. In this jar is the most highly chemically contaminated human food on the planet. It has more dioxin, more toilet deodorizers, more moth-proofing agents, dry cleaning fluid, pesticides, and PCBs than any other human food. And they didn't get there on purpose. They were carried to us by ecological forces outside of our individual control. They represent a form of toxic trespass. So we haven't yet contaminated human breast milk to the point where it's a worse food for babies than infant formula, but do we really want to wait? Is it not a right, I would argue, of a newborn baby to receive mother's milk that's pure and uncontaminated? What we love, we must protect. So thanks for listening.
A cancer cell is made rather than born, and it's made over a period of a long time. The changes required to transform a cell is a multi-step process. Chemicals can play a role all along those pathways. This old 1950s idea of DNA as this big computer that sits in our cells that flips all the switches and controls everything is really a misnomer. Our genes are more like the keys of a piano. We inherit this sort of instrument, the piano, that's our DNA, but it's environmental signals that we receive that play certain keys, whereas other keys stay quiet. And so it's really the way our environment and our genes interact that determines whether we get cancer or not.
About 90% of our PCB exposure comes from diet. And what it comes from is diet that involves food that has fat, because that's where the PCBs are stored. So all of the stuff that we know probably we shouldn't be eating too much of, but is really tastes good, milk, butter, eggs, beef, all contains the highest levels of PCBs. And the highest levels that have been measured in Canada come from freshwater fish. How long a PCB stays in our bodies really depends on our metabolism. Some people might get rid of these more quickly than other people, and that's one of the genetic susceptibility factors that we're looking at. So one of the next steps is to look at genetic factors that might interact with the PCBs in causing non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Good afternoon, Mr. McGuffin. This is Agnes Lai from the BC Cancer Agency calling. Thank you for your participation in the non-Hodgkin lymphoma study. Now I would like to ask you some questions about illness experienced by members of your immediate family. These questions apply only to biological relatives such as your parents, brothers and half-brothers, sisters and half-sisters.
My study was all new cases of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma is a cancer of the immune system. And one of the main hypotheses of the study was whether high exposures of organic chlorine chemicals, including PCBs and insecticides, might lead to an increased risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And what we found essentially is that the people with non-Hodgkin lymphoma who participated in our study had higher level of these PCBs in their serum than people who didn't have non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Traditionally, the definition of a carcinogen is something that causes damage to the DNA, such as radiation. But it's not likely that PCBs are acting in that way. It's possible that PCBs somehow lead to a suppression of the immune system, and that allows for the non-Hodgkin lymphoma to develop. Another possibility is that your immune system is constantly producing lymphocytes to fight this invader. That may simply lead to an increased risk of something going wrong. I think we're in some ways lucky with the association with PCBs in that they are no longer produced in North America. They have to be disposed of properly. We have very strong regulations. However, there are many other environmental contaminants that we are introducing every day, and we really don't know what their cancer-causing potential is.
Behind me is a continuation of water called Buzzards Bay, and at the very top of that sits New Bedford, which is a harbor. Over the years, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of PCBs were dumped into the top of Buzzards Bay in New Bedford Harbor, making that body of water the most contaminated PCB region, certainly in North America and maybe in the world. A few years later, the head of one of the companies who were responsible for dumping them said, you know, we don't really have any real evidence that PCBs are making people sick. And that was actually a true statement. Since that time, we've learned a lot. And what's going on here will be a decades-long cleanup project. Maybe taking as long as 68 years. I see this as a kind of success story because, in fact, PCBs are one of a handful of chemicals that we did ban when we had an inkling of harm. And now we know all kinds of other terrible things about PCBs that tell us that that decision was a good one. The fact that we successfully banned PCBs and our economy didn't crumble, I think is a testimony to what we could do with the other 80,000 synthetic chemicals out there. That could have been the lesson of PCBs. It still could be, I think.
Whether it happens at a hospital bedside, at a doctor's office, or on the phone, most of us remember the event of our diagnosis with a mixture of photographic recall and amnesia. We may be able to describe every word spoken, the arrangement of photographs on the doctor's desk, the exact color of the office draperies, but have no memory of how we got home that day. Or we may remember nothing that was said, but everything about the bus ride. For 29 years now, I've had these follow-up cancer treatments, this kind of medical surveillance where I have the cystoscope. Some of my urine is collected for cytology and sent away. And for 29 years, the answer has basically come back the same. You know, it looks fine.
And so for me, psychologically, as soon as the cystoscope itself is over and I know the urologist has looked at the inside of my bladder, for me, that's where I begin to relax and say, now I have another year in front of me. And that's how I felt. Until a week later, I got an unexpected phone call. And that afternoon was a beautiful sunny day in September. Of course, I'm behind on some writing deadlines, so I'm working really hard to finish a writing project. The kids are coming home on the bus, so I'm making dinner. I threw some tomatoes in the stock pot to blanch them so they're kind of boiling away on the stove. The phone rings. My assumption is it's my editor asking me, okay, where's your essay? But it's not. It's the nurse from Dr. Voorhees' office to say, we got the results back from cytology, and there are abnormal cells. And the world changes in those moments, you know. So all of a sudden I hang up the phone, I look out the window, there is the same September sun, there's the last of the tomatoes in my garden. I can still hear the tomatoes in my stock pot kind of bobbing away in the steam. I look down at the computer screen, there's the cursor blinking away on the same sentence that I was in the middle of before the phone rang. But the world suddenly feels like a very different place now. Suddenly it feels like time to stop, and I might be on an entirely different path. In fact, I don't know what path I'm on right now. After Silent Spring was published, hearings were held by the Senate. And Rachel Carson testified for 40 minutes to a packed room with lots of media attention. The poignancy for those of us who admire Carson looking back on those hearings was to realize that she was dying of breast cancer at that time. Cancer was really not talked about at all, and so the word was not even used. We in the biological community are not supposed to put the first person pronoun, I, into our story. You know, all of our data are supposed to be independent of who the scientist is. And so you're supposed to step out of the picture when you're presenting your data. She had her own story to tell, but it was a private story and she left it out. She simply made her case. Woods Hole Research Center here on the Cape is hosting an 80th birthday party celebration for one of the scientists I admire most in this world, George Woodwell. He's been one of the great champions of the work that I do. He has never been afraid to take the findings of science out into the public eye. He's really a scientist in the public interest. George Woodwell and other scientists picked up the banner of Rachel Carson, who studied here at Woods Hole, and their research led finally to a ban of DDT. And that decision opened the way for a banning of PCBs a couple of years later, in 1976. In your work, and even in our conversation now, it's a seamless move for you to say, you know, as soon as we know something, we have to do something about it. I think that's rare. I do have colleagues who say, you know, my job is to simply generate this data and publish it in the peer-reviewed literature and then step back, that if I should have a vision of how the world should be different based on my research, I'm no longer objective. But you've never stopped. You've always
That's
said...
absolute rot. I mean, if you know something
Yes.
for sure, there's no point in saying that you don't know it for sure and can't use the information. If you have a hammer and you think that you need to drive nails, and the experience is that the hammer drives nails, you can assume it will drive nails tomorrow as well as it drove them yesterday.
If I should go on and die of bladder cancer, we don't know if it was the solvents in my drinking water when I was a child that killed me or something else I was exposed to. So We're burying thousands of people a day from cancer, but we can't say, oh, this is the guy who died because of the incinerator. This is the guy who died because we allow pesticides in our food chain. And the anonymity of the victims, I think, is part of the struggle.
Mm-hmm. It's true. On the other hand, we know chemical intrusions on air and water and land are causing a higher frequency of death. We would not allow somebody to enter society and say, I can make money by killing a few people a year. Right. That's outrageous. We can't have that.
Right.
So we need to look at the outrageous things that are occurring as a result of carelessness or callousness, make them public issues. It is the duty of the scientific community to turn into this realm and turn that realm into political strength.
I think we're ready to get started. Everyone to find their table.
The setting for our celebration tonight, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum, is particularly meaningful to me. I was always proud of the historic role my home state played in the human rights struggle to divorce our nation's economy from its dependency on slave labor. Indeed, I named my son after another leading Illinois abolitionist, the writer and Presbyterian minister Elijah Lovejoy. I see some of you nodding out there. When I say my son's name, Elijah, I'm reminded that big changes are possible. As I am tonight, standing in the Abraham Lincoln Museum to make the case that cancer prevention is a human rights issue. What are the human rights implications of chemicals like PCBs and atrazine? The European Union decided in 2003 to ban atrazine. The US government has taken a look at these same data and concluded that not enough damning evidence has yet accumulated to make a similar decision on this side of the Atlantic.
You know, that room was full of politicians and legislators, CEOs, heads of boards of directors, a lot of money in that room. I was talking about things that some of the people in that room didn't want to hear.
There is more troubling evidence for a link between atrazine and human cancer, based on the evidence we have right now, than there was for PCBs in the 1970s when they were outlawed. And that is a difference of politics, not a difference of science. We could insist that our state and national governments follow Europe's example. Or we could be silent and allow things to continue as they are. When carcinogens are introduced into the environment, some number of vulnerable persons are consigned to death. I think we should become carcinogen abolitionists. Here in the land of Lincoln, even one death by involuntary exposure to a cancer-causing chemical is too many. Thank you.
I felt myself trying my hardest to find the best words to describe the evidence and the data, and to have them not turn away, to keep them listening to me. Rachel Carson had little respect for scientists who knew the evidence but refused to speak out politically. I see myself as continuing to break the silence I still sense. I don't have time to put a happy face on cancer. Cancer is a waste of time, and that's the best thing you can say about it. Cancer is a serial killer. So I hope that came through last night.
When results come back from the cytology lab, there's actually 3 categories. There's category 1, which is where I wanted to be and always have been. But I'm in category 2. I have cell clusters, which are normally not found in voided urine, so I did a second test, and the results of that came back, and that required that I do a third test. And in this case, there were no mutations associated with cancer. I'm still in a place of ambiguity. Although the chromosomes look fine, the cells still don't look completely normal. I think what it looks like from the outside is that either the person has cancer or they don't. And either, if they do, they're either going to survive it or they're not. And yet, the truth of it is that very often we're asked to come back for more scans, that we're asked to come back for more tests. And you end up in this period called watchful waiting, which means that you are vigilant and you get second opinions. And the veil of secrecy is usually pulled around those times of ambiguity because we don't know what to tell people. We can't say, I've had a recurrence, nor can we say, I'm fine. So we get very vague and we say something sort of cheerful that makes people not ask too many questions. I'm trying to give a message that's not mine alone, but which are a collection of many voices, a lot of whom are silenced now.
First, I hope this committee will give serious consideration to a much neglected problem, that of the right of the citizen to be secure in his own home against the intrusion of poisons applied by other persons. I speak not as a lawyer, but as a biologist and as a human being. But I strongly feel that this is or should be one of the basic human rights.
The ultimate legacy of those hearings was the Environmental Protection Agency that would have oversight, that would really think about these things, react to damage that had already been done, but hopefully create a new policy for going forward. Carson died months after those congressional hearings, so she knew herself to be at the very end of her life. These were her very last speeches. This was her last best shot at getting this information out to the public. I think all speeches are important. So if it's 13 people in a church basement on a Friday night, then there's a reason that we are there. I never want to feel like I've come all this way and I've made people give up their time and their evening and left children at home with babysitters for something that isn't going to change our lives in some way.
Either way that you like, that's good. So much.
You're welcome. Well, I hear the applause. I wanted to open my talk by breaking a taboo in our culture. My intent was to pull back the curtain of secrecy. Well, I'm always reminded, of what Audre Lorde said. She was a poet and a cancer activist who died of breast cancer. And she said, your silence will not protect you. And I think about that a lot, actually.
So the first time I met Sandra Steingraber, it was before she wrote her first book, Living Downstream.
Do you have a pen I could use quickly? One last revision.
A movement is that a movement celebrates poets. A movement knows that its poets are its voice. A movement honors Sandra Steingraber.
Let's go ahead and just get lined up here just by this first arrow, still in the dark.
Please join me in welcoming Sandra Steingraber.
Years ago, in between my sophomore and junior years of college, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer. I had just turned 20. I was hoping I would live long enough to have sex with someone. I hadn't done that yet. I could not have imagined that someday I would stand before an audience of thousands and say, 30 years ago, I had cancer. Unbelievable. A few weeks ago, on a sunny afternoon, the phone rang while I was trying to meet a writing deadline. It was the nurse in my urologist's office. She was calling to say the pathologist had found in the urine collected from my last cystoscopic checkup abnormal cell clusters, and also blood. What am I trying to say here? Are you fine or not, Sandra? What's the end of the story? Well, I don't know. I am living within a period of time known as watchful waiting. Much of my adult life has been watchful waiting. Watch means vigilance, screening tests, imaging, blood work, self-advocacy, second opinions, and hours logged in hospital parking garages. Wait means you go back to your half-finished essay, to the tomatoes on the stove. You lay plans and carry on within the confines of ambiguity. You meet deadlines and make grocery lists, and sometimes you jump when the phone rings on a sunny afternoon. As a college undergraduate, I made a bet. I bet that my cancer diagnosis had something to do with the environment in which I lived as a child. And I think I was right about this. 10 years ago, in the fall of 1998, I gave birth to a child. I became a cancer patient at 20 and the mother at the brink of 40, which I know isn't how most people's lives are ordered, but that's how mine worked out. I am betting that in between my children's adult lives and my own, an environmental human rights movement will arise. It's one whose seeds have already been sown. I am betting that my children and the generation of children that they are a part will, by the time they are my age, they'll consider it unthinkable to allow cancer-causing chemicals to freely circulate in our economy. They will find it unthinkable to assume an attitude of silence and willful ignorance about our ecology. In the same way that I look back on the life of Rachel Carson, my mentor in all this, who died when I was 5 years old, and I find it unthinkable that she could not speak about her own cancer diagnosis, even while dying, as I have spoken about my diagnosis with you today. 30 years of feminism lies between my life as an adult scientist and Rachel Carson's, so that I have never had to fear, as did Carson, that my status as a cancer survivor will be somehow used to impeach my science. And in the same way, I look back on the life of Abraham Lincoln, whose portrait hangs in every schoolroom in Illinois, and marvel that our economy was once dependent on slave labor. Unthinkable. I believe our grandchildren will look back on us now and marvel that our economy was once dependent on chemicals that were killing the planet and killing ourselves, and they will think of it as unthinkable. Now, I am willing to concede that this environmental human rights movement that I am betting on is less an evidence-based prediction than a mother's fervent hope that my children will never have to fear the phone ringing on a sunny afternoon. An environmental human rights movement is the vision under which I labor, from which I am not free to desist, and which may, if we all work together in concert, become a self-fulfilling prophecy. May it be so.
They let me sneak back here and talk to you. My name's Rena. I'm from Peoria, and I'm an 11-year cancer survivor.
What kind of cancer did you have?
I had leukemia.
Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you must have been really young.
I was 12.
Yeah.
And for years we've been saying there must be something about this area, especially people who live on the eastern side of the river.
Yeah.
Because
I'm from Pekin, so I'm on that side.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know.
I've just known a lot of people who are from Pekin who haven't made it. There's so much to do there. I have a hard time with this feeling that I left.
I mean, I never tell people what I think they should do. You have to bring your own passions and interests, and marry.
environmental health concern to whatever it is that you want to do.
You're such an inspiration to me. I'm so glad they let me sneak back
Yeah,
here.
If I could think of anyone I needed to talk to right now, it would be somebody from my hometown who went through what I went through. I've never yet met somebody who was diagnosed with cancer who says, well, we're all going to die anyway, right? So why bother with the chemo? In fact, I find just the opposite. Suddenly they're willing to bring their whole fighting spirit to bear to solve this problem. I want us to bring that same fighting spirit to cancer prevention. We know for certain that if we took carcinogens out of the air, food, and water, we would save lives. We don't know if it would be my life or somebody else's life, but it would be somebody's life.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope that you enjoyed the film and that you're excited to hear Sandra and Chanda speak a little bit more about it. I'm Shelby Lisk, and I'll be the moderator tonight. I'm a filmmaker and a writer, and I currently work as a journalist for TVO, which is Ontario's public broadcaster. We'd like to first start by thanking the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences at Ithaca College and the Canada Council for the Arts for making this screening possible. And now just introduce Sandra and Chanda. As you know from the film, Sandra Steingraber is an ecologist, a cancer survivor, and a mother. She's also a distinguished scholar in residence at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. And Chanda Chevannes is a film producer and director. She's a Canadian documentary filmmaker, writer, and educator who aims to amplify women's voices with her work. And before we start, I just want to remind everyone that if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat window. That should be just to the right of the video, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can. So to start, can you just tell us a little bit about how the film came to be? What were the main motivations? How did it get up and running? And maybe Chanda, you can start with that.
Sure. So I read Living Downstream, which was a book that Sandra wrote in 1994. And I was immediately struck by how visual it was. In reading the first pages, I could kind of picture the big skies of Illinois. And I thought, oh gosh, someone's going to make this into a movie one day, and I can't wait to see it. I read the book, felt really inspired, felt like I had learned a lot, and put it on my shelf. And a few years later, I came back to it again, which is pretty unusual for me. I love to read, but I usually only read a book once. I picked it up again, read it again, and thought, oh gosh, someone's got to make a movie. Put it back down. The first time I read it was high school. Second time was in college. The third time I picked it back up and I was working at a documentary production company in my hometown of Toronto. I read the book again and I got really angry this time. I was like, damn it, why isn't someone making a film based on this book? But about halfway through reading it, I thought, maybe it's supposed to be a documentary, not a fiction, like a narrative film, an acted film, as I had kind of imagined it initially. And maybe I'm the person who's supposed to make it. So when I had that kind of realization, I tracked Sandra down, left her a bunch of voicemails on all the different phone numbers I could find, and asked her if she'd be interested in working with me on the film. We kind of chatted for a while. It took a little bit of convincing because she was a busy mom with 2 young kids and working as a writer and a speaker. So she was very busy. And I said, it will only take 10 days of your time, and I think it will have tremendous benefit. And here we are 10 years later, and I've taken much more than 10 days of Sandra's time.
Sandra, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think that's right. I mean, the book was actually originally published in 1997, not 94. But when Chanda began to work with me creating the film adaptation of the book, by then, I forget what year we started, Chanda. I know the film was released in 2010, but I felt like we wanted to represent the science with as much new updated science as possible. And so, and this whole field of epigenetics had emerged. And so I approached my publisher and asked if I could release a second edition of the book that would be released coincidentally with the film. And then I could bring the science up to date. But the funny thing was, enough time had gone by and I'd already published other things that my writing style had changed. So as I was rewriting Living Downstream, thinking that I was just going to swap this science out for new science, I ended up sort of rewriting a lot of the personal story too. But I also had to mimic the way I used to write, which is different than I had, like we change as writers. So that was a sort of interesting discovery. But also, I just want to say that there's a real reciprocity between the film and the book, in that as Chanda was showing me some of the rough cuts and some of the scenes,
a couple things. One is that she and I have a really similar way of looking at the world, so that the camera's eye is really the way I see the world. The little details the camera lingers on, like there's a chain link fence and a couple of birds and a scene. Those are just the kind of things that I would focus on if I were walking through that world. So so in some way the camera became myself, but of course Chanda is shooting things that I myself can't actually see in my real world, like me up on the stirrups having a cancer checkup is something that I'm just completely inside my own body and inside my own head, dealing with my dread and anxiety, and so I'm not really observational. And so the camera's eye caught what I looked like in those moments, but also things about the room itself, which in my imagination is always this kind of vast chamber. But when you take a whole camera crew in there and you see the rough cut, you realize what a simple, dopey room it is, right? It's just this kind of little cinder block space. And I actually changed into my backless blue cotton gown in this little weird space next to the filing cabinet where all these posters, I don't know if you guys caught this, but all these posters of penises are all around me, because mostly urologists have men with prostate problems is this kind of the bulk of their patient population. So all the male genitalia tracts are all around me as I'm changing. And that struck me when I saw the film as hilariously funny, but that's not, if I hadn't seen the film version of what I do, I wouldn't see it that way, right? So I actually rewrote some of the scenes of me as a cancer patient based on what Chanda's camera showed me. So it's the book and the film are actually adaptations of one another, I would say.
Yeah, that's actually one of the scenes that kind of struck me, is when you're at the doctor's office and they're checking for abnormal cells. And I was watching and I just thought that's a very vulnerable thing to let them film. And I was wondering, what was it like just to be a subject of a documentary film?
Well, in that particular scene, it turns out it's better to take a whole camera crew into a urologist's office. It was like having a security detail or, bodyguards. And by then I had become so familiar with being mic'd and having the boom mic over my head and having Chanda sort of giving signals to the camera guy. And so I felt actually safe and protected, oddly enough, in those moments. And the film we'll see next week, there's actually scenes of me going to jail and in handcuffs, and my son and I got pepper sprayed in Romania and in the middle of this kind of police riot. And again, I felt like I was safe because Chanda and the camera crew were there. And not only because that, like, by then they were, we were a close collaborative creative team together, but also just because they were bearing witness. And I knew I didn't have to just rely on my own eyes and ears and my own memory of what was happening, that this was being, the sound and the visual imagery was being captured. And it was going to become a story that we were going to tell. So that feels powerful to me.
Sorry. There's a question from the audience. I really enjoyed Sandra's conversation with her husband. They felt very warm and insightful. What was your approach to striking a balance between the personal scenes like that and the more informative ones?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that we weren't quite sure what the balance would be for the film when we started. When Sandra wrote Living Downstream, she was telling us about, her kind of 20-year-old self who was first diagnosed with bladder cancer. But this was 29 years later that we were filming these scenes. And so the stories that were told in the book couldn't really be recreated. Like, I wasn't interested in doing recreations of Sandra's life. And so we had to find ways to kind of get into her personal life in present day, but have that help us understand what her past experiences with cancer had been like. And Jeff, Sandra's husband, helped us to do that. through conversations with her. Sandra's mom, Kay, also really helped us to do that with that great scene on the swing in her yard in Pekin. And so these moments kind of help to give us a window into Sandra's life. We knew that the film would oscillate between the personal and the science, because that's what the book did. It was just kind of finding the right rhythm, which actually took us a lot of time in the edit suite. But I like to think that we got there in the end with it. We wanted it to be, we didn't want it to be detached. I think that one of the issues that we sometimes have with scientific documentaries is there can be a lot of facts and a lot of information. And as a viewer, you can feel kind of overwhelmed by it. And so we really wanted to bring people into Sandra's story, into her life, and then kind of let the science flow from that, so that it was a more personal story. You weren't coming away with like facts and figures and images, diagrams in your head. You were coming away with a real woman's story, and really understanding how the science, how the chemicals have affected her life and the lives of many other people through her story.
Yeah, I agree with that question as well. That was something that I noticed as a non-sciencey person. I don't know if I could have watched, an hour and a half of just the science, but, there was a really good rhythm between the environment and science and personal stories. And then there's the history stuff as well. But one thing I was wondering about, and I think, Chanda, you have thoughts on this, is that documentary filmmakers, we often look for active stories that are sort of unfolding as we're filming. And although, things were happening, Sandra was in that period of what she was calling a watchful waiting. And so I was wondering, was this the story that you had in mind from the beginning when you were making this film? And what were you hoping would happen or would change while you were shooting?
I didn't really expect that there would be an active story. I thought that we would use Sandra's, the personal moments in Sandra's life as a way to illustrate things. And the doctor's visit was really just about illustrating the kind of ongoing burden that cancer survivors experience of kind of living this medicalized life. We didn't know that there would be a turn. And that was, a shock to everyone. Sandra was lucky enough to let us tell that story in the film. It could have been something that she kept to herself, that she didn't share on camera, but she chose to bring us into that world. And I think that it made the film feel much more immediate. It made it feel much more relevant. It helped people who have never had cancer to better understand what that experience is like. So I'm very grateful to Sandra for sharing that part of the story, because I know it's a challenging piece to share, with the world especially as it's unfolding.
So let's talk about a little bit of science. I just said that I didn't want to talk about science. Now let's talk about science. So a question for you, Sandra. What is the most important change that you've seen in the 10 years since the film was released? And what do you think the next step is?
Well, I guess I'll just go to the last scene of the film where you see me at the podium kind of making this prediction, right? That in between my adult life and my children's adult lives, that this environmental human rights movement will emerge. And so now my children are 19 and 22, and they're both in college, meaning that they're Zooming into remote classes, right? And so what I've seen in those 10 years is a movement emerge, but I wouldn't call it an environmental human rights movement so much as I would call it a climate justice movement. Which is has human rights as its focus, right? So this is how I see things now, that the environmental crisis is like a tree with two trunks, and along one of the trunks of the tree is what Living Downstream is all about, and what Rachel Carson before me wrote about, which is the contamination of our shared world by inherently toxic chemicals that find their way inside of our bodies, and that sort of communion of our bodies and this poisoned world is what I write about in the book Living Downstream, is the story that Chanda brought to life in a visual narrative, right? Well, the other trunk of that tree is of environmental crisis, is what fossil fuels are doing to our atmosphere through their combustion. Fossil fuels really just being the corpses of 400 million year old marine mammals that are either crunchy and we call it coal, or gooey and we call it petroleum, or vaporous and we call it natural gas. So this unholy trinity of fossil fuels is shoveled into the, you know, ovens we call power plants that are really crematoria, because we're burning these corpses that we've exhumed out of the ground, and we're loading up the atmosphere with heat trapping gases as a result. So that is the story that has now captured all of the attention, and rightfully so, because there is a time limit on this story, right? Like, we can go on poisoning ourselves and giving 20-year-olds cancer from now until forever, but we can't just keep loading, and you know, people will die, and it's a human rights problem for all the reasons that Chanda and I have explicated. But we have about 10 years left of loading the atmosphere up with heat trapping gases before we hit these irreversible tipping points, after which, no matter what we do differently and how we reform the system and how fast we decarbonize, we are off the cliff, right? And our planet becomes uninhabitable to ourselves. Agriculture doesn't work anymore. Civilization begins to crumble and so on. And so it's right that we should focus on the climate. That being said, I just want to make the connection here that all of the chemicals I write about in Living Downstream, and that Chanda shows, like PCBs in the film, they're all derived from fossil fuels. So that's why I call it a tree with two trunks. They have the same roots, right? Which is that we are exhuming out of the ground these fossilized hydrocarbons that, if we burn them, we call them fossil fuels. If we take them into a factory and rearrange their molecules, we call them petrochemicals. So we're both poisoning ourselves and we're threatening to destabilize the climate. And so the movement that I saw 10 years ago has coalesced around the other trunk of the tree. And that's good and correct. And that's where I locate my own work now. And that's what the film Next Week in Fractured will kind of take up.
Mm-hmm. And kind of, there's a sort of related question here from the audience. Pat Townsend asks, where are we with eliminating atrazine now?
Oh, hi, Pat. Well, unfortunately, you know, under this current administration, I have seen all of the work that a lot of us did get accomplished has been undone. So rules and regulations and things that we were putting in place, pesticide registries and lawn chemical reforms, those are, you know, it just, a wrecking ball has been swung at all of this stuff. It's been very, very difficult. So, you know, atrazine remains in the United States a hugely used chemical, and yet we have, you know, even more proof than we did 10 years ago of its carcinogenic potential, and for good reason. It's banned for use in the European Union.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that really struck me when I was watching the film was, you know, you could just be a scientist and be doing this research, but you had this calling to explain these things to the public. And so you're both kind of doing the same thing. You both, you know, really want to connect dots for the public and share evidence and present it to them in the way that they can understand. And I was wondering, why is that important to both of you, and how did you come to that, you know, that work? And let's start with you, Chanda.
You know, when I was growing up, I always had these kind of twin impulses. One was to do something creative, and one was to do something that somehow kind of helped people. And so my creative impulses made me think of, you know, maybe I should be a writer, or maybe I should be an actor. And then my helping impulses were like, you know, nurse, teacher. And I decided that it would probably be harder for me to do the creative stuff. And so I decided to go to film school. But when I went to film school, I took a course in Canadian film history, which was basically a history of Canadian documentary film. specifically documentaries that were made by the National Film Board of Canada. And I watched the most interesting, artful documentaries. I didn't even know that a documentary could be artful before taking that course. And not only were they artful, but they were strong works of art created to inspire social change. And it was like this light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, oh, I can do both of these things. I don't have to pick between being a creative and being someone who makes change in the world. I can unite them both under this banner of documentary. And so that's why I'm kind of driven to do this. You know, something that's interesting to me is that a lot of activists are kind of driven by something that happens in their life. And, you know, I'm not going to tell you what drives Sandra. She can tell you herself, but, you know, she was a young cancer survivor and then spent years trying to understand the environmental links to cancer. I didn't have anything like that that drove me specifically, but I've just always had a strong need for justice. And I also really believe in trying to work deeply to experience joy. And I think that in this world, especially, we need more justice and we need more joy. And so my work, I hope, is about creating a little bit more of both.
And Sandra, I think that you say in the film that you sort of changed trajectories a little bit and to, working to explain the science to the public. And I'm curious what brought you to that, and why did you decide to go that route?
Well, I think that's the story of Living Downstream that you just saw, that Chanda captured, is, my life was utterly changed in between my sophomore and junior year by this diagnosis. And it was as if a big cane had come out on stage and pulled me off stage. The rest of my biology major colleagues were either in the organic chemistry lab or they were out partying, and I was in and out of the hospital. Of all human cancers, bladder cancer is the one most likely to recur. I live a highly medicalized life even 40 years later. It's also the most expensive cancer to have because you can have a good outcome, but it does tend to recur. So, I have amassed a lot of medical bills over my life, and sometimes it would get so overwhelming, I would just sob and throw them all in the garbage and just wreck my credit rating. And so, that the experience of having cancer brought me to this sense of justice of, why is it okay for some people to make profit off of marketing poisons and for young women to pay a terrible price? And why is it okay that we don't have, Medicare for all? It's not my fault that I got this cancer. And yet I don't have a retirement account. It's 851 because of it, right? So it goes on wrecking my life. And I appreciate what Chanda said about joy, because I think a lot about that too. I guess I just want to circle back around for a minute to the very first question you asked about, when Chanda reached out to me, and why that moment where I had to make a decision about should I release my book to be turned into a film by this filmmaker. And she sent me her previous work, which I just immediately loved, right? Because you see the lyricism and the beauty and the joy of the world captured by her camera. And then you also see this commitment to justice. And those are the two things that animate me. So I just knew pretty quickly, and I'm not a very intuitive person, actually. That's the scientist in me, I guess. I just like, show me the data. But as soon as I saw her previous work, I just knew that we were simpatico. Like we were, despite our differences in our ages and our backgrounds, that we sort of saw the world in a similar way. So my trust in her ability to turn this into a visual narrative was very high right from the very beginning, and has always remained high, in the two films that we've made together.
And just as a follow-up to the question about why you do the work that you do, I'm going to quote you, Sandra. At the end of the film, you say, we in the biological community are not supposed to put the first person pronoun I into our story. All of our data are supposed to be independent of who the scientist is. And so when I heard that, I found it really relatable because I'm an Indigenous journalist who covers Indigenous stories. And so people constantly are questioning my objectivity and my closeness to the subject. And so I was wondering, given how the public and the scientific community think about objectivity in general, how do you navigate or reconcile when you're going about your day-to-day work?
Well, I just do it. And, if anyone asks, I will be very straightforward about it, which is that scientific objectivity is the skill set we bring so that we can look at a whole pile of data and let it speak to us and tell us what it shows us, right? But if at the end of that objective analysis, what we see is that ovarian cancer rates are rising among teenage girls, and it looks like girls who live near certain polluting industries are higher risk, then I, as a scientist, am no different from any other citizen. I have an obligation to protect life. And so, in other words, scientific objectivity is not the same as political neutrality. And I keep walking further down that path so that, so you see me in a kind of advocacy role in Living Downstream, but in next week in Unfractured, then you see me as a civil disobedient. So I'm trying to speak data to power in Living Downstream, right? But what happens if power doesn't listen and they just say, we're not looking at your data, we're just going to go ahead and put this gas storage facility in anyway? What do you do when the data can't speak? And that's the story of next week's film. So I am both an activist and a scientist, and I don't think that's a contradiction. I think all science is political. I think all science is also objective. But once we have evidence that people are being harmed, we have to do not neutral things about it. That's part of the duty of being a scientist. I mean, obviously science is supposed to be, make the world a better place. So we're not done with the science when the analysis is done. We're obligated to kind of go tell it on the mountain, I think.
Mm-hmm. And there's a scene in the film when you go visit your cousin who's a farmer, and you talk about how he's using some of those chemicals that you think should be banned. And, right now in the world that we're living in, there's people who don't believe in COVID, and there's any number of conspiracies going around. And how do you talk to skeptics in a productive way, especially when those people might be people that you love?
Well, I mean, leading with love is always, my first impulse. And that said, I don't try to persuade, I just bear witness. And I'm more interested now in creating grassroots political power among those of us who do look at the science, whether it's on climate or COVID or toxic chemicals, but are really missing a political skill set and don't quite know what to do about it. So they fall into despair. And so I'm more interested in taking the people who do accept the science and getting them to take action on what they accept to be true than I am trying to convince skeptics, There's none so blind as those who will not see. So I think we can normalize taking action on climate. We can normalize carcinogen abolitionism, even if we just have a small subset of people who are working on that. And then everyone else just has to kind of go along with the new normal. I mean, I think of it as kind of like with cigarettes, right? Like, I was born in 1959, which was the year of peak smoking in the United States. And so it was totally ritualistic that on the very first day of kindergarten in Pekin, Illinois, Mrs. and Mrs. kindergarten class was put to work making ashtrays. Like, that was our very welcome to kindergarten art project. We made little ashtrays using our own hand as like the mold, right?
And then we put these little tiles in and they dry and we take it home to our parents at the end of the day. So that just seems crazy to my own children. You know, my daughter would say something like, so you're telling me, Mom, that 5-year-olds were put to work making drug paraphernalia for their parents. It's like, well, yeah, but we didn't think about it that way because ashtrays were just this normal thing, right? So we have denormalized the ashtray. We have denormalized cigarettes, and they don't represent glamour anymore to my children. My kids think that they're just, it's just gross. And so that's what we need to do with, you know, with fossil fuels. It's with cancer-causing chemicals. And so I'm just interested in the way that the arts play a big role in that sort of changing the story on what things mean and what they signify.
Yeah, so to that end, Chanda, you're also an activist and doing the same kinds of things. How do you think about objectivity and talking to skeptics with your work and in your life in general?
Well, so documentary people often conflate documentary filmmaking with journalism. And those people do not really understand documentary filmmaking. I think that there is a piece of my work that is journalistic. We did a massive amount of fact checking, especially on Living Downstream. I read so many scientific articles, you know, even though I have no science background, Sandra helped me translate them. We were really, really careful that the information that we presented was factually accurate. But we are storytellers, and the truth, the factual accuracy is not the same as a truthful story in all cases. And so I see myself more as a creative filmmaker than I do as a journalist. I don't have any journalistic training. And so for me, I do not, I don't try to practice objectivity with my work. I am filtering everything that I do through my own lens, through my own ideas. And I'm really unabashed about that. I think that for too long, everything has been filtered through the white male lens, whether it's documentary filmmakers, journalists, scientists, and that's created a really warped perspective in our world that we're kind of like slowly trying to unmake right now. So, you know, I have a deep kind of ethical sense about how to tell a true story, but I don't think of it in terms of objectivity, I guess. You know, one thing that I would just like to say is that because fake news is kind of so rampant right now, the kind of work that we do as documentary filmmakers, which is kind of intense and can take a while, but is really deep and really very carefully considered, I think is more important now than it maybe has ever been. And so I feel really honored to be in this line of work, actually.
Mm-hmm. We actually have a question from the audience for you, Chanda. Hannah Shields, who says they're your daughter. She said, I have a question for Chanda. What is it like to take care of a newborn when you were making this film?
Right. So when Sandra and I first kind of met over email and phone calls, I was just about to get married. And then by the time I had actually secured the funding, it was 4 years later. And I was just about to have my first child, Hannah, who's now 12 years old. And, you know, it was one of these moments where it had taken so long, we didn't think we were actually going to be able to raise the money. And I had wanted to start a family. So I got pregnant. And then, you know, kind of a minute after I found out I was pregnant, I also found out that I had the money to make the film. Thanks very much to the Series Trust, who gave money for Living Downstream and for Unfractured. They were the lead funder of both of those films. And I realized that, I had these kind of two big projects that I was birthing simultaneously. So yeah, Hannah, it was pretty terrifying, if I'm being perfectly honest. But it was also really joyful. Like, I took Hannah on almost all of the shoots over 2 years, and my mother and Hannah's dad and Hannah's grandpa all traveled with us at different points so that I could make the film with her by my side while I was still nursing. And in fact, if you remember that scene in Congerville where Sandra passes around the jar of breast milk, that was my breast milk. That was 12 ounces of breast milk, which would have taken me 3 days to pump. And it was a really meaningful experience, actually, because a lot of what we do, the reason that we do it is for our kids and their kids and the next generation. And so to have Hannah with me during that experience was really profound, and challenging too, very, very challenging. But I wouldn't trade it for the world.
I love that story. And I wanted to just let everyone know we only have a little less than 10 minutes left. So if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. And the question, I guess it could be for both of you as well. The archival footage in the film is really great. And I noticed that you chose to put it in, it's not right at the beginning, you put it in about 20 minutes into the film. And when you're talking about a science story like this, at what point is it necessary to include some of the history, and how do you do that effectively? Do you want to start that, Chanda?
Yeah, archival footage is always kind of challenging for me as a filmmaker, because I like my films to feel of a piece. Like, I want you to watch minute 5 and minute 25 and for it to have the same feeling, the same pacing, the same look. And whenever you bring archival footage into it, that changes just automatically because it's not your footage. Having said that, there's some film footage in there, and then there's also some beautiful stills of Rachel Carson. But we kind of played with it in a way so that the look of it echoed the look of the film itself. There was never a question for me that that Rachel Carson would be a part of the story. She was such an inspiration to Sandra, and Living Downstream really followed in the footsteps. The book Living Downstream really followed in the footsteps of Silent Spring, and so it was definitely something that we wanted to include. It took a bit of figuring out how to do it, but in fact, Living Downstream does mention Silent Spring in it, and some of the images that you see in the book some of the images that you see in the film are images that were described in Sandra's book. So that, the kind of most maybe horrifyingly weird comic, illustration ad with the housewife dancing with like the cows and the pig, and they're all singing DDT is good for me. That was something that Sandra described in the book, and we hunted it down to find it. So definitely we took Sandra's lead in the kinds of images that we might want to find to tell Carson's story. But for me, kind of the important part was not just the science, but also the personal connection between Sandra and Rachel, in terms of their experiences of cancer, being two women scientists, telling these kind of larger stories.
And for you, Sandra, I'm curious how you think about that sort of in a similar way with your book, sort of how you put the history into it, and whether or not would that change at all? Would your way to approach it change at all after doing the film?
Well, I guess it's writers have it easier than filmmakers because there is a lot of archival material, historical material in my book, but I'm the maker of the sentences, so I can maintain the archival historical in my own style and tell it in my own voice, so I don't have to worry about it feeling fragmented or changing the pacing, right? So I appreciate that how many more moving parts a film has, So Carson is a is an actual character in Living Downstream. She appears first in chapter 2, and she was keeping this secret of her own cancer diagnosis while trying to warn the world about the hazards of pesticides, including their ability to cause cancer. And she feared that her enemies in industry would learn about her cancer diagnosis and use her autobiography to impeach her science and say that she couldn't be objective. And then they're already using other parts of her autobiography. Carson loved a woman, and she kept that as a secret too, but she was still in this coded way kind of accused of being, a spinster. So why did she care about children? So it was her facts of her life were used to cast aspersions on her credibility as a scientist. And so Carson's role for me as a nonfiction writer is to set up the harm and the price that someone pays by keeping it a secret and making it clear that even though she's my kind of guardian angel and inspiration for all this work, in chapter 2 of the book, I make it clear that I'm going in a different direction, that I am going to tell that not only this update the science that Carson first brought to our attention about the harm of chemical carcinogens, but I'm also going to pull back the curtain and tell you about my own life, because behind every data point when it comes to human cancer is a life, right? And so I want you to hear about my life, even as I kind of revealed in chapter 2 some of the details of Carson's own life. And I should say that publishing Living Downstream and then having the book come out had an unintended consequence for me with Carson, because I was then asked by Library of America, which does these definitive editions of American authors. And so, authors are kind of canonized by being brought out by Library of America, who pledges to keep these beautiful editions in print for forevermore, right? So they'll never go out of print. So when they chose Carson to be brought into the Library of America canon, they asked me to edit the collection. So not only is it a reissue of Silent Spring with all of her beautiful drawings in it, but also I include in there all of these love letters that she wrote to Dorothy, letters that she wrote to her fellow scientists, so you can see her scientist brain at work trying to piece together how the argument's going to go in Living Downstream. But most moving to me are you see private writings at the end of her life when she's worried that she won't live long enough to release Silent Spring. And I mean, in the end of her life, she had a whole team of women living with her who were taking dictation, who were bringing her boxes of research notes. Her writing hand went numb because she had tumors in her vertebrae. And so I write about that a little bit in Living Downstream in chapter 2. And then I got to become the editor of her work. And that's like the biggest honor of my life, to be able to handle her, archival materials, her private letters and things that are in, a lot of them are in the Yale University Beinecke Library. And then, with all the staff at Library of America, these sort of wonderful team of editors there, compile them all into this collection. So.
That sounds amazing. To have your idol, to see their whole life and their personal life. That's really cool. So someone squeaked in a question just at the last minute. Ben Spurkle, he said, the concept and importance of truth in American politics and media has changed so much in the last 4 years. How does that change your approaches to science, filmmaking, and communicating ideas? So I don't know if maybe if you want to keep it really short to that big question. Chanda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you just rephrase it one more time, Shelby?
The concept and importance of truth in American politics and media has changed so much in the last 4 years. How does that change your approach to science, filmmaking, and communicating ideas?
It doesn't. I mean, my idea of truth has not changed. If it's changed in American politics, it just means that we have to keep doing the work that we've been doing all along. I mean, I'm like horrified by what's happening in the US. I'm horrified by what's happening in Ontario right now around COVID. We had a politician today or yesterday who stepped away from the mic rather than answering questions about the government's response. We have to hold political officials accountable. We have to keep doing the jobs that we've always done, but it doesn't change my own personal work, except that I feel more urgency in what I'm doing now than I did 10 years ago. And I felt a whole lot of urgency 10 years ago.
And what about you, Sandra?
Yeah, I think that's right, Chanda. I feel that way too. I mean, while listening to the question, I just kept flashing on the whale in this, the autopsy of the whale in the scene in the film, which also appears in my book. And we just have to keep telling that story of that whale. Those whales, their bodies are there. They're dying. They're being poisoned. They're losing their habitat to climate crisis. And so it's on all of us, whether we're authors, filmmakers, or scientists, to make everyone look at the whale. And Chanda and I do it differently. I mean, the way that whale with cancer appears in Living Downstream is in a chapter about cancer and wildlife, and it's a very lyrical chapter. It's almost there's a lot of religiosity in that chapter. All the whole color scheme of it is white and red, and it's the scene in which I pee blood into the toilet bowl, and the toilet bowl is white. It's chalice shaped. It's almost like this communion vessel. There's blood in it. And then there's this white whale that's also bloody, right? And because Chanda, as a filmmaker, had to go actually find a real whale where it's autopsied. It's my whale in the chapters in the water. Her whale is being winched onto this autopsy table, so it takes on a different meaning. And Chanda spent a lot of time working with focus groups to make sure that wasn't too gory of a scene. But I think Chanda and I both want you to look at the damn whale, right? You can't turn away from the whale.
That's actually so funny, because we came up here to join the conversation and it was on that scene, and I was eating a bowl of cereal and I was like, this is the worst scene in the movie to be on right now. I'm eating. But I'm gonna squeak in the last question before we're done. Is the film just preaching to the choir? Who is the audience, and what impact did it have, or will it continue to have? And who wants to start?
Sandra, why don't you take the choir part and I'll take the impact part.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to quote my author friend Janice Ray, who said, sometimes the choir needs an altar call, right? So asking someone to read a book is a different commitment than asking them to walk into a theater and watch a film. I mean, here's the book, Living Downstream. It's actually 400 pages and it's got hundreds of footnotes. It will take you kind of days to get through it. But with books, people stop reading books if they don't like it. They just kind of stop. Whereas a film, requires 90 minutes of your attention, but you're probably not going to get up and walk out unless it's really, really egregiously awful. So once you're in the theater, you're probably going to stay in for the whole journey, right? So I think I'm just interested in getting the people who are motivated enough to read my book, or if you're a college student, you're assigned to read it and have to write a paper about it, but to actually change their life and do something about what they read. And same with the audiences in films. They're coming into a theater, like when we were able to do it live, where you're all out there, we've got you all in one place to have this conversation, and we can kind of give you marching orders to go out in the world and find your place in this. And Chanda, you say what that place is.
Yeah, what impact did the film have, and what do you hope it will continue to have?
Yeah, I've heard from many different people that it's impacted them in different ways. Actually, when Sandra and I were screening Unfractured, in Michigan at her alma mater. Someone came up to me and said, and he was, a college student then. He said, "Living Downstream changed my life," which is like the craziest thing that you might ever hear from an audience member. But many people have told me that. I've heard from people who have started schooling in public health because of the film. People have used the film as an organizing tool. So get everyone out to a screening and then teach them on a local issue and get them to do visits to the state capitol. We've had many teachers use the film. We have an educational DVD that's housed in more than 1,500 universities and nonprofit organizations across the US and Canada. So I think there is this kind of ripple effect that has happened with the film that's been really amazing and very rewarding for a filmmaker who wants to make film for change. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, the impact is kind of large and wide, and I hope it keeps going. I'm really happy to see all the chat that's happening tonight. And I'm glad that people have felt inspired by the film and that they learned something from the film, even if they've watched it already before. And for those of you who haven't seen the kind of, I call it the sort of sequel to Living Downstream, which is Unfractured, we'll be screening that next Monday at 7 p.m. I've put the link to the Eventbrite, a registration link, in the comment section just down below my head here. And also, if you don't want to register with Eventbrite, because I know some people were having a hard time, you can just click on that second link that's down there and watch live at 7. So you don't need to register as long as you have that link. But I think, Living Downstream really taught me a lot about science, but Unfractured taught me a lot about the power of science and activism to create political change. You had this question at the beginning about filmmakers looking for this driving narrative, and Living Downstream is pretty much a very kind of gentle scientific story that Sandra and I were kind of unfolding for the audience. But Unfractured is a really driving narrative. We're following Sandra. She's waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and going to Albany. And it's like this ongoing sequence of events that happens, which really excited me that we had the opportunity to do that. So I'm looking forward to talking about that next week as well.
Amazing. So I want to say thank you so much to both of you on behalf of everybody who's watching. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for making this film, and thank you for being here with us tonight. And thanks to everyone who attended, and shout out to Chanda's daughter for putting in a question, and everyone else who did. And lastly, I want to thank again the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences at Ithaca College and the Canada Council for the Arts for making this possible. And as Chanda said, please join again next week for a screening and a Q&A of Unfractured, which continues to follow Sandra's story. That's everything. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a good night.
Thanks, Shelby. Thanks, Sandra.
Yeah, thanks. Good night, you guys.